In this week's video, we look at Luke 10:25-37, which includes the story of the Good Samaritan. So let's jump right in. And a lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And he said to him, "What is written in the law? How does it read to you?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." But wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied and said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers, and they stripped him and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. By chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion, and came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And he put him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day he took out 2 denarii, and gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay you.' Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands?" And he said, "The one who showed mercy toward him." Then Jesus said to him, "Go and do the same." So this passage has 2 main parts. The first part is this questioning by the lawyer about what he has to do to inherit eternal life. Now this part has some parallels in the Gospels. The story of the Good Samaritan is unique to Luke, but there are 2 types of passage that are generally identified as parallels to this first part, verses 25-28. The first is a rich man who comes in Matthew 19, Mark 10, and Luke 18, and asks Jesus the same question about inheriting eternal life. Now in that instance, Jesus quotes 5 or 6, depending on your gospel, of the 10 commandments, says, do these. The man says, "I have done these." And Jesus says, "Well, in that case, go, sell your possessions, give the money to the poor, and you come and follow me." And the man goes away sad. So same question, but it plays out a lot differently. The other parallel, the one that's usually identified as the parallel in Mark and Matthew to this particular passage, is in Matthew 22 and Mark 12. In that instance, a lawyer or a scribe asks Jesus what he thinks the greatest commandment is, and it's Jesus who responds by uniting Deuteronomy 6:5, which is the "you shall love your Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul," and so forth, and Leviticus 19:8, "you shall love your neighbor as yourself." So again, some parallels, but the Lucan account is unique. It combines these things in a way that we don't see elsewhere in the Gospels. Now, Luke 10:25-37 is actually structured very tightly. There's the same development in each of the 2 main sections. So we begin with the lawyer asking a question, "What do I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus responds by asking him a question, "What is written in the law?" The lawyer answers Jesus' question, "Will you love God wholly and your neighbor as yourself?" And so then Jesus answers his question. "That's correct. Do this and you will live." We then start the process over again. The lawyer asks another question. "Well, who is my neighbor?" Jesus tells a long story, which then culminates in another question. Which of the 3 became a neighbor? The lawyer answers Jesus' question. Well, it was the one who showed mercy. And then Jesus answers his question. Go and do likewise. Now, as you can see from the boldface print, this whole episode emphasizes the importance of doing. So as we saw in our study of James, faith is not just about having the right theology. We are expected to express that. The other thing to note is that in each case, before the lawyer's first question, it gives his motivation. So in the first instance, it says that he did this to test Jesus. Now, whether this is testing in the sense of trying to trap Jesus, or whether this is testing him because he's a lawyer and this is the new teacher on the block, and so he just want to take his measure, it's not clear. Could be either one. Similarly, in the second section, it says he asked because he wants to justify himself. Now, most scholars understand wanting to justify himself in the sense of wanting to justify why he just asked Jesus a question that he obviously knew the answer to. You do get some scholars, however, like Kenneth Bailey, who suggests that wanting to justify himself here is about wanting to establish his worthiness to inherit eternal life. Kind of like the rich man who says, I've done all of these things. Okay, so who is my neighbor? I want to make sure I nail this down, and he's looking for praise. Now, the other thing that is worth noting, the passage that comes immediately after this is the story of Mary and Martha. Mary, you may remember, sits at Jesus' feet, just marveling in his presence, while Martha is busy trying to get ready. And eventually, in her exasperation, she goes to Jesus and says, Jesus, will you please tell my sister to get up and help me? And Jesus says, no, Martha, because Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Okay? John Nolan suggests that that passage also belongs with these other two, 25 to 37. 25 to 28 establishes what it is we have to do. Love God and love our neighbor. Okay? But it's two different commandments. The story of the Good Samaritan then shows what can happen when love of God inappropriately dominates love of neighbor. Okay? The priest and the Levite just ignore the potential neighbor. The Mary and Martha story, on the other hand, shows what can happen when love of neighbor, which is what Martha's trying to do, serve those who are coming into her household, showing her love of neighbor, inappropriately dominates love of God, which is exemplified by Mary wanting to sit at Jesus' feet. I find that an intriguing reading of this passage. Moving to the story of the Good Samaritan. Most scholars identify this story as an exemplary story. An exemplary story differs from a parable proper in that in a parable, things tend to represent something else, whereas in an exemplary story, they tend to stand for themselves. So, for example, in the parable of the sower, the seed represents the word, or the word of the kingdom, and the different soil types represent different conditions of the heart. Whereas in the story of the Good Samaritan, the priest and the Levite represent a priest and a Levite, and the Good Samaritan represents a Good Samaritan. So this is generally categorized as an exemplary story because the people in it represent what they claim to be. Jesus says, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell to robbers, who went away having stripped him, beaten him, and left him half dead. Now, from Jerusalem to Jericho is about 17, 18 miles, and you descend about 3,300 feet as you go down. In the ancient world, this road apparently had a reputation for being a haven for bandits and dangerous. So there's a fair bit of verisimilitude here. What happens? Well, a priest comes down the road, passes by, a Levite does the same, and then a Samaritan comes and has compassion. He binds the man's wounds, takes him to an inn, cares for him, pays the innkeeper for expenses, and then promises to return and cover additional costs. Now, there are several parallels in this passage that are worth noting. First of all, notice how Luke describes how close each of the men get to the man who has been robbed. The priest went down on that road, so he's following the same direction, same road, but doesn't get very close. He probably sees well in advance and just crosses over to the other side and keeps on going. Possibly because as a priest, he is worried about contracting corpse impurity. The Levite, however, comes to the place, right? So he seems to get closer. He probably stayed on the same side of the road until he could ascertain better what the situation was, but he doesn't go all the way up, and he ends up crossing to the other side as well. The Samaritan, on the other hand, goes all the way to the man, and that enables him to then take the actions that he does. Luke also puts in parallel how he describes what each man does. So the priest, seeing him, passed by on the other side. The Levite, and the language is exactly the same here, except it leaves out the him, it gaps it. Seeing him, passed by on the other side. So each of these two men sees the man beaten, stripped, half dead, and decide to pass by on the other side. In this, they parallel the robbers who went away and just left him there. The Samaritan, on the other hand, sees him and has compassion. That then becomes the turning point of this narrative. He then binds his wounds, takes him to an inn, and makes sure he's taken care of. Now, most interpreters who read this story see it as holding up the Samaritan as the good example of what it means to fulfill the neighbor love commandment. The point is then that he's a Samaritan. The Samaritans and Jews did not get along well. They did not like each other. They had some history where they hadn't been nice to one another. So the fact that it is a Samaritan who comes along and tends to this probably Jewish man who wouldn't necessarily have a claim to be a neighbor of him, and yet he's the one who actually fulfills the neighbor love command. There are two alternative takes on this that I want to discuss. One is by Kenneth Bailey, and he suggests that the point is not just that the Samaritan comes and does some good things, but that the Samaritan fully compensates for the failures of everybody who has come before. And this is shown by the inverse way in which Luke describes what the Samaritan does, how each one corresponds to one of the previous groups. So when the Samaritan first gets to the man, he binds his wounds with the oil and wine. And Bailey says, well, the Levite could have done at least this. He could have taken care of the man's wounds, tried to tend to him a little bit, make him a little more comfortable, but he doesn't do that. He doesn't even extend basic first aid. It then says the Samaritan took him to an inn on his own animal and cared for him. So he doesn't leave him there, but he puts him on his own beast, his own animal, probably a donkey, and then leads him the rest of the way down to the inn. Bailey says this corresponds to the priest, who, as belonging to a higher socioeconomic class, probably would have been riding on the road. He says this would have been assumed in the culture, and the same way that, if I said, I'm going to Durham tomorrow, you would assume I was driving, not that I was going to walk. Same thing, back then, priests had means, and so they likely had a ride. In fact, Bailey says this, without this assumption that the priest was riding, the story loses a great deal of its thrust. If the priest had been walking, what more could he have done besides offer first aid and sit, hoping that someone might come by who could really help him? Because really, you can't do a whole lot there by the side of the road. The parable turns on the presupposition that what the Samaritan did, at least the priest could have done. Okay? So it's not that the Samaritan was the only one who had the possibility of helping. They all could have helped in their way, but they didn't. Finally, the last bit corresponds to the robbers. Whereas the robbers take all of his money and possessions, the Samaritan pays for his stay at the inn and his upkeep. Whereas the robbers leave him half dead, the Samaritan makes sure that he's being taken care of. And whereas the robbers just leave him by the side of the road and go away, the Samaritan promises that although he has to go away, he will return and make sure that everything is taken care of. So for Bailey, the Samaritan is redeeming what each of the others failed to do, which fits in well with those who want to identify the Samaritan symbolically with Jesus, which has been a common thread through the ages. The problem with this is that it just doesn't seem to work linguistically. Luke does not seem to have structured his passage in this way. There are no lexical parallels between the priest, the Levite, and the corresponding things to suggest we should parallel them. And even the way he describes the various actions. Bailey groups them into sets of 3, but Luke doesn't really group them in that way. Doesn't mention that the priest was writing, which means that you have to assume that he was. That's certainly possible, but if that's what Luke was going for, it would have been nice if he had signaled that in some way. So I'm not overly convinced by this. There is a second reading, however, and this is John Nolan's proposal. He wrote the Word Biblical Commentary. And Nolan suggests that the focus on the Samaritan as the example, as the exemplar of neighbor love, is misplaced. That's not what this passage is actually asking the lawyer to do. Instead, what Jesus is encouraging him to do is to take the perspective of the man by the side of the road, because he's the focus of the story. He's the one who needs a neighbor. So this is what Nolan says. What is being commended is the victim's perspective, not the example of the Samaritan. What he does is commendable, the Samaritan that is, but from the perspective of the desperate victim, it is self-evident that the law's demand for love of neighbor should bridge to any needy human being, that its practice should not be restricted to a closed community, even if that closed community is the community of the divine covenant, where your neighbor was typically understood to be your fellow Jews. The lawyer asks, who is my neighbor? Jesus suggests that we should answer that question from a vantage point of isolation and desperate need, and then make use of the same answer when we come at the question from a position of strength, when it is within our gift to be handing out favors rather than receiving them. In other words, when the lawyer says, "Who is my neighbor?" he's asking that from a position of strength, trying to limit his liability. Okay, well, so who do I have to take care of? And what Jesus says is that's taking the wrong perspective on the question. You should instead approach the question from the perspective of those who are in need. If you were in need, if this was a matter of life or death, who would you want to be your neighbor? And how would you want your neighbor to behave? When you're in that kind of situation, you would even take one of the hated Samaritans for a neighbor, right? Because beggars can't be choosy. And so this story becomes basically an encapsulation of what it means to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You think about not how you would behave from the position of strength that the lawyer seems to be in, but instead think about it from the underside and how you would like others to respond to you in that situation. And then you let that be your guide for how to behave when you are in the position of strength and able to reach out to others in that way. Now, Nolan does recognize that the Samaritan does become an example. Jesus tells the lawyer, "Go and do likewise." But he says that that's indirect and secondary. That is not the primary focus of the story. Of course, when Jesus asks the lawyer who became a neighbor to this man, he responds, "The one who showed him mercy." And so Nolan suggests the answer to Jesus' question is not oblique in order to avoid speaking about the hated Samaritan. Rather, the wording underlines the point of the parable. Looking at it from the point of view of the desperately needy, it is the practice of mercy that makes a passerby into a neighbor. And so the question we should be asking is not, "Who is my neighbor?" which again is the question that comes from a position of privilege and strength, trying to limit our liability. Instead, what Jesus says, the question you should be asking is, "Whose neighbor can I become?" And so as we think about this passage this week, a few questions to keep in mind. One, is there anyone in your orbit whom you tend to overlook? They're kind of on the periphery of what's on our mind, what's in our sight, and even though we see them, we don't really see them. It may be that God is calling you to be a neighbor to one of those people. Secondly, who do you come across during the course of your week who is in need of mercy? Story seems to suggest that extending mercy to those who are in need is what makes us a good neighbor. And finally, whose neighbor can you become? How would your day go differently if each day you start out and ask, "Okay, God, today show me someone whose neighbor I can become," and then be on the lookout for it throughout the day? All right, well, have a good week, and I will see you on Sunday. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, please click the like button down below. Consider sharing with your friends and subscribe to ensure you don't miss any future content.